webinar. You can ask questions using the chat box or the chat function. Please keep your microphones muted. We've got a lot of people on the meeting today, so we'll just help keep the meeting running smoothly to have everyone on mute. We'll attempt to answer all questions, and we've allowed a lot of time for that. There's a relatively short presentation to get through initially, and then we will take questions. If we don't get to your question, please send it through to hydrogensafety@rshq.qld.gov.au, and that information, as well as the minutes, will be provided after the meeting. Thanks again, everybody, and Bill, I'll hand over to you to do the introduction.
Thank you, Nancy, and it's wonderful to have the amount of people joining the call this morning, or the this webinar Teams event. It clearly demonstrates and shows the level of interest in the hydrogen space, and obviously our lane that we're specifically focusing on is hydrogen safety, and narrowed down into the mobility component of what's happening out there in the industry and the broader Australia in terms of the development of this exciting industry. So my name is Bill Dade. I'm the Chief Inspector of the Petroleum and Gas Inspectorate in Resources, Safety and Health Queensland. So we regulate hydrogen as a fuel gas in Queensland, and obviously today is, I guess, part of this journey in terms of engaging with the industry and through the main effort of our code of practice under development. So we're just obviously still letting a few people in. My team today is scattered. Myself and Marshall Holmes are physically in Brisbane. Nancy and the team are in Townsville, and we've got a couple other people on the call from Petroleum and Gas on the Sunshine Coast. So I guess in this brave world of COVID over the last 20 months, we've kind of all got used to being highly distributed at home, in the workplace, all around Australia. But obviously, just keep your machine on mute until the opportunity presents itself to ask a question, and then that will be managed to get maximised the opportunity and the time. So the purpose of today's session is to discuss our code of practice that we are developing specifically in relation to mobility. On the panel today are several of my petroleum and gas colleagues and team members, some of whom you've met. Nancy in Townsville gave the housekeeping introduction. Paul Beaumont, Tony O'Connor and Marshall Holmes, and they'll chime in throughout the course of this morning's activity, and they'll present to you and answer questions at the end that you may have of detail. And we'll send out with the minutes from today their specific emails, etc. So if you've got any follow-up questions immediately from today or in the future, you know, Marshall's the pipelines, Tony looks after fuel gas, etc., Paul on devices. You know who to talk to, because I think with this sort of, from what I remember 10 or 11 years ago when the CSG to LNG industry was getting going, it was about who in government was the point of contact for what particular part of or what issue I was most interested in. We co-regulate some of this, not inconsistently with LPG and other industries, with our colleagues in the Office of Industrial Relations, Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. Major has a facility, and I think Grant Hasty and other colleagues are on the phone. So it's not just, we're not the only regulator involved in hydrogen safety, that the other agency I just mentioned, and we are hardwired into the broader Queensland interdepartmental working committees, such as the Hydrogen Department, Department of State Development, who've got other specific focus areas, be it in grant money, industry development, etc. But I suppose in terms of the broad safety and health aspects, you know, MHF, OIR, Workplace Health and Safety, and Petroleum and Gas Inspectorate, I probably have got the left and right hand in terms of the safety and health effect for the hydrogen industry. Okay, we've also got, in support of our endeavour with the code of practice, is contractor GPA Engineering, who are also on the line. They've been engaged by us to draft the code of practice, and they'll help with managing today in terms of the content, taking your feedback. So it's great to have the guys on the line from GPA helping us out. So if you're here today, we're talking solely about hydrogen safety in terms of mobility. That's not to say we won't take other questions if it's about a pipeline or something else. That opportunity can be presented either through the question and answer mechanism we got on this webinar, or liaising with the guys, Tony, Marshall, etc., the guys afterwards, that we provide their contact details at the end. So, but obviously with the 2 hours we've got, we're just going to focus in on the most immediate part of where we're at, what we believe that we need to, in terms of, I guess, develop, and what is immediately on our plate in terms of the mobility part of the hydrogen space. Okay, so that's sort of it's fantastic, as I said, to have you all here, and I'm sure hopefully be productive and informative next couple of hours. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Nancy to talk about the broader regulatory framework for hydrogen safety in Queensland, and then we'll get into a bit more detail. So over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, Bill. As mentioned by Bill, the focus today is mobility. So just to give a bit of context around that scope, the mobility includes the refuelling stations, vehicles or vessels that are using hydrogen as a fuel, and the refuelling station includes all equipment on that refueler and even supply to the refueler. We've selected this area, as Bill said, we know that there are already compliance gaps in terms of our legislation, and we've already got projects that are live now with hydrogen Q fleet vehicles on the road and refuelers already in Queensland. So what the Code of Practice is aiming to do is to provide some minimum safety requirements and frameworks for compliance. We don't know what the industry is going to look like over the next 5 years, so what we need to ensure is that the document is flexible enough, but also puts that emphasis on safety. What we're looking at is to try and engage with industry and project components in these early stages. I'll move on to the safety framework for hydrogen in Queensland. So this infographic gives a bit of an overview. RSHQ are the lead regulator for hydrogen when it's used as a fuel. Many of the existing uses of hydrogen is for chemical processes, food processing, manufacturing, that are outside of being used as a fuel, and these are currently regulated under workplace health and safety frameworks, and will continue to be. That's the grey area on the top left. Major hazard facilities are also regulated by the Major Hazard Facility Unit in the Office of Industrial Relations, and that will continue to be the case. Most of the export scale hydrogen projects will be major hazard facilities. So the new areas, and where the Petroleum and Gas Inspectorate regulate, are where hydrogen is used as a fuel in the smaller scale applications. So the key areas that we're seeing this emerge include transport, and that's where we're focusing today. So that's dispensing hydrogen to buses, cars, trucks, trains, potentially smaller vessel as well, marine vessels. The other safety regulators, as I've mentioned, are Major Hazard Facility Unit, the Electrical Safety Office, and Workplace Health and Safety. This code is specific to Queensland compliance. From the perspective of the supply chain, there are two key areas from a Petroleum and Gas Inspectorate perspective. The first part of the supply chain is the operating part. That includes the supply of the hydrogen to the refueler and the refueling station. And the second part is the actual vehicle itself, the gas system, the device, and the gas device and the vehicle. So Tony and Paul are going to go through each of these aspects in a little bit more detail, and then we can discuss questions towards the end.
Thanks, Nancy. My area is around fuel gas storage and distribution. I also cover LPG and compressed natural gas and biogas and such. So hydrogen fits in naturally as a fuel gas as defined in our legislation. So we're going to treat that the same way as we do our other gases. So operating plants are defined in the Act and the safety regulation, including that hydrogen delivery and hydrogen fuel stations being one of them. The network includes the storage and handling of hydrogen, and as say a service station, where traditionally we've seen LPG dispensed with an on-site tank plus pipework and a dedicated dispenser. We will now see either hydrogen storage, compression and dispensing into vehicles, or we might have on-site generation of hydrogen where it will be stored, compressed and once again put it through a dispenser into a vehicle. So there's a lot of similarities in the process, and our current regulatory framework is well suited to the adoption of hydrogen. Some of the requirements for hydrogen for operating plants, as defined in our in the Act and regulation, is to have a safety management system, which is pretty much the same as in most industries. Safety management systems are everywhere. So this one specifically has to comply with Section 675 of the Act. Its contents very similar to Australian standards on safety management systems. Also, there's a couple of regulatory requirements for notices to be given. So, and the first one is a commissioning notice. So we become aware that the plant is about to become operational 20 business days before it actually is commissioned. And we also require statutory positions to be notified to the Inspectorate using an online form, and that's about the executive safety manager, the operator or operator's representative, and site safety managers. So once again, consistent across all the other operating plant that we regulate. In the picture on the screen, there's a couple of different plans there, and a couple of different scenarios where if the hydrogen is produced for a fuel gas, then it's transported to site for storage, compression and dispensing. And the second one is where it's actually all done on the actual dispensing on site. So both of those plants will need the requirements for the commissioning notification and the statutory positions and the requirements for safety management systems. Okay. Just we want to touch on odorant. So the regulatory requirement to have our gas odorised when it's supplied to a consumer. Now, recognising that the fuel cells don't like current sort of odorisation, and we know there is some projects overseas about trying to find a better odorant. So we've got to have the gas odorised before it goes into the vehicle. So to address this conflict, it's proposed that the Code of Conduct is going to provide some alternative safety requirements. So as a means of compliance when we can't use odorisation. So this may be as simple as a risk-based approach, ensuring the risk of an undetected gas leak is as low as reasonably practical, which is what the main focus of our legislation is to keep that risk at that level. So we're very interested in the feedback, as Nancy was saying, either at the end of the meeting or post the meeting, regarding what people currently in the industry are researching, what is actually in place now in other countries or under development. And that we want that to be able to feed into this code of practice to make it as complete as possible. And that's all from me. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you, Tony. That's the upstream aspects around the mobility space, and I'll now hand over to Paul, and Paul can talk us through the downstream and gas compliance side.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Nancy. So my role is within the gas work and gas devices space in the Inspectorate, and it's a little bit more prescriptive than the operating plant side, where we work quite tightly with standards and with requirements to hold gas work licenses and gas work authorisations. However, there is some discrepancy powers within our legislation to issue authorisations and licenses based on demonstrated skills and knowledge rather than prescribed qualifications. So when it comes to fuel cells, obviously this is slightly uncharted territory. We have in the past approved fuel cells on very individual bases for companies that wanted them to test them in remote locations, but obviously the interest in fuel cells is growing, and fuel cells that are used in vehicles for propulsion or stationary power supplies do meet our definition of Type B devices. So having said that, they require approval for installation and use, and also the person undertaking the work requires some form of authorisation to do that work. The traditional qualifications probably won't be complete to allow that work, so we're looking for feedback through this roundtable and through other feedback prior to the deadline in relation to what competencies or skills people think might be applicable for that gas work to be undertaken. In addition to that, there's obviously an opening there for gas device approval authorities. Our traditional gas device approval authorities are probably a little bit more focused on combustion side, use of fuel gases, combustion use, rather than fuel cell technology. So we welcome conversations about what kind of skills, qualifications and knowledge an applicant would need to demonstrate to hold that kind of authority. It's important to understand the difference between a fuel cell that propels a vehicle as opposed to our traditional motor fuel authorisation, where LPG, traditionally LPG, has been used as a fuel for a reciprocating engine, where we've only classed the actual storage of the gas, the piping of the gas and the injection of the gas into the engine as the Type B device. With a fuel cell, because it's a standalone unit within the vehicle that propels an electric, that powers an electric motor to drive the vehicle, the fuel cell itself becomes a Type B device, and the storage and the piping becomes part of a gas system. But it won't be necessary for people undertaking that work to hold a gas work licence. That can all be covered under a gas work authority. As I said before, we just need to have an open conversation about what we think those qualifications look like. And then, of course, we're looking for the code of practice to provide information on those types of skills and qualifications in relation to hydrogen, in the first instance, as Nancy said, in relation to the mobility side of things. So that's about it with working with hydrogen at the moment from me.
Thanks, Paul. I think that sort of gives a bit of an overview, I guess, of what the requirements are around the mobility sector in terms of the operating plant aspects and safety management systems, and then once it gets into a device or a system, the requirements around the gas system. There's obviously some gaps with the current framework that we need to then address in the code of practice. Hopefully that's clear. The gaps in the current system is clear in the discussion paper and the presentation today. But we'll now take any questions that you can enter either in the chat box or send through after the meeting to Hydrogen Safety if you think of them afterwards. but the chat box is open for any questions. And Daniel, I'll hand over to Daniel from GPA to coordinate and.
Thanks, Nancy. So there's been a number of questions submitted prior to the presentation, so we might try to go through some of them first. So Nancy, the first one's aimed at you. Production, is that considered within the scope of the PNG Act, and will it be considered in the Code of Practice, or hydrogen production?
Yep, it's a good question. So production of hydrogen as a fuel gas currently is not covered in the scope of the PNG Act. There is an intention to look at that scope in the future and include production of fuel gas. Where hydrogen is produced from a fossil fuel like natural gas, it is within our scope. So it's a little bit of an oversight, I think, at the moment. Hydrogen is the only substance under our legislation that is a fuel gas, but it's not petroleum. So we cover production of petroleum, which covers all the other aspects. But production of fuel gas, while it's intended to be in the Act, it's not really covered. So the intention is to look at that in future, but it's not going to be addressed in the initial version of the Code of Practice.
Thanks. Summarises that well. Maybe Scott from Ireland's got a couple of questions around the recording and whether it'll be shared after the meeting. So maybe get that one out of the way.
Yes, we will share the recording along with the minutes and a summary of these questions after the meeting. So anyone else that's interested in that.
Perfect. There's been a question around the legal standing of the Code of Practice. So maybe some advice around how it's how it's going to be captured, and both now and in the future. What's the intention?
I'll take that on, Daniel. It's Bill Day. Okay. So overarching, our intention is to sensibly regulate the development of this industry, not to stifle it, not to block it, not to be obstructive, but to sensibly and safely regulate the development of this industry. And where we need to coordinate and deconflict and work together with our other agencies, such as MHF, RSHQ that's been mentioned, we'll sort that out at the Queensland government level. But our intention with this Code of Practice is to clearly communicate the requirement that we see, and obviously in the first instance focusing in on mobility. The Code of Practice is a normal device that we use that is enforceable under law, and we have those for the construction and abandonment of petroleum gas wells. We have codes of practice for leak management, etc. So in developing a Code of Practice, there's the discussion paper, industry consultation, i.e. what we're doing today, a draft Code of Practice that Croshy and the crew will help us with at GPA, and they're our lead on the pen, informed by your feedback and your comments on the discussion paper, and then a development of a final Code of Practice that in 2022, on a date to be advised, we will make it enforceable through an amendment to the regulation, the PNG Safety Regulation 2018, if I've got that right. It'll be enforceable. So in the future, that is our intent. And I think that's in the discussion paper. But in the first instance, I've always believed that those who we regulate should have a say. And hence your involvement here today, 100 odd people, obviously sharing the slides, the minutes, and the opportunity to engage further with the specialists, Marshall and Tony and Paul Beaumont, etc., in the journey to develop the draft through the penmanship and intellect and expertise of GPA back to us. The draft will be then circulated for everyone to comment on. Most likely, and we'll confirm this in the new year, that we may have another forum like this, another open forum to discuss the draft Code of Practice before we finalise it, etc. So that's the sort of intention in terms of the law. A Code of Practice, like the two Codes of Practice I mentioned before, we update them regularly. I think we're up to version 3 of the petroleum gas well construction abandonment and version 4 of the 5 of the leak management. So these are dynamic documents. They don't sit still. We do once and we come back to it in 2029. That's not the intent. This thing is an adaptable document, but we're looking at the areas in the industry development of hydrogen that's in front of us. And as I mentioned right at the start of my opening remarks, we are members and we're hardwired into the broader Queensland Government industry development committees and working groups that's looking at hydrogen. So, hydrogen department, state development and other agencies around government. And so we see the list of projects that range from highly likely to probably less likely, that span of 80 or 90 projects. So we're zeroing in the ones that we're seeing right now, and some of those have been in the public realm right now. For example, trucks in Townsville to carry zinc briquettes, etc. So we're aware of those. But that's the intention. Sorry, it was a long-winded answer, but it conveys our intention in terms of the code of practice and where we see it going to, and then our intention as common sense regulators here, not to stifle industry development, but to see it occur sensibly. But overwhelmingly, I think you'd all agree, we want it safely done. And and the code of practice will have maximum use of ISO and Australian standards. It will be very, very unlikely, and unless I get specific advice from GPA and the other experts we've engaged, that there'll be a Queensland specific, standard or something like that. Because obviously we're well aware, my team, we're well aware that like the gas industry, it transcends the state borders. It's APA, AGIG are doing blending projects in Gladstone. They've done some in Adelaide, etc., etc. So we're aware that it'll be very, very unlikely that there'll be a Queensland specific and maximum use of other existing Australian standards. Hence, some of the team that have spoken this morning are on those Australian standards committees. We're a part of the FF, CRC, etc. So as I said, we've been tracking this for a couple of years. I don't say we're experts. We're not across 100% of it, but we're certainly not at new starters or 10%. I think we're reasonably up with what's going on in the broader space, and obviously our partners there at GPA will keep us, and provide their expertise, because obviously of their network across Australia and the globe, because obviously there's a hell of a lot happening, in Europe and other places as well as across Australia. So a long-winded answer, but that's our intention. It will eventually be enforceable as other codes of practice are under our Act, but not before next year. Okay, so that was a fairly fulsome answer to that question. Hopefully, Daniel, that nailed that one well. Hopefully, I answered the question from the author.
Yeah, no, it did. I think you touched on another question, so maybe we'll go back to that. So what type of coordination with other states and federal level will this document have? I think one of the questions was around different codes for different states. So how do you see it interacting with other states?
Daniel, when the thing is drafted by your good penmanship, I'm sure, other jurisdictions will have the opportunity to provide us feedback on it. So, for example, if I go back to the coal seam gas industry or petroleum industry, we have shared, I think, just about every code of practice, fact sheet, plan that we've ever developed, because obviously Queensland has had now for over a decade that CSG to LNG industry. So we've shared with other emerging jurisdictions who may not have been up to where Queensland is. We also share stuff with the South Australian regulator, with the unconventional land-based gas industry. My guys, Paul Beaumont, he's on the Gas Technical Regulatory Committee, which again is a national body. So if other states want to leverage off what we're doing, because I think in my estimation, we're the first jurisdiction to take this step, I'm happy for that to occur. And then, as I said, we're hardwired in through membership of Australian standards committees, FF, CRC, and other committees where people can have a look at that. And I can't speak for the other jurisdictions, but yes, Nirvana, in my humble opinion, would be one across the whole, of the country. But all I can do is influence what we do in Queensland under our Act. And so I'm happy for it to be shared, for people to provide their comment on it, and it will be obviously available when we get to that drafting stage. If that answers that question, Daniel.
No, I think it does, and I think Queensland are the first ones to put something like this together, so they'll be a leader in this space. There was a question from Kevin, maybe this is towards Paul or Tony. What is the relationship between GWA and GDAA?
I'll get Uncle Paul to handle that one.
Yep.
Yeah, so so they're both authorities to undertake particular roles in relation to gas work and gas devices. The GWA is a gas work authority, so it allows a person to do gas work, and the gas device approval authority is in essence a device approval, so a design approval of a particular type of device. So our legislation talks about a gas device being approved for supply, installation and use. So a third party, a holder of a gas device approval authority, approves a device just as they approve a domestic hot water unit or a commercial catering appliance at the design level. And then the gas work of installing it and commissioning it and getting it working correctly is the holder of a gas work authority. So hopefully that gets it, Daniel.
Yep, no, I think that's that makes it pretty clear, Paul. So maybe there was a question from Diana Hinson. How is the scope of this document just limited to hydrogen used as a fuel? What about hydrogen derivatives such as ammonia? Nancy, maybe that one's aimed at you.
Yeah, look, it's a good question and certainly something we've considered. Obviously, it's another emerging application, and we're seeing ammonia being spoken about as well as other derivatives going into the future. So at the moment, we're not seeing applications there, but it's certainly something we're considering. And I think the response will have to follow what makes sense. If ammonia is being used in gas devices in the same way as hydrogen or natural gas, then it would probably make a lot of sense to consider including that within the same framework. But that discussion and decision, I guess, hasn't yet been made. But we'll have to certainly watch that emerging industry and make some decisions around that if we see it being used in the same way as other fuel gases.
Yeah, perfect. That summarises that well. So there's a big question around separation distances. Will this document provide any information about the minimum distance from H2 storage for sensitive areas? Nancy, maybe you might have some thoughts on that and how it's already captured in existing Australian standards or international standards.
I'll let Tony take that.
Yes, it won't be spelled out in the actual code of practice, but the reference standards, the international one about separation distances. So yeah, we wouldn't spell it back out again. We just reference that. It is has been recognised, and that's in the one of the working groups around storage and handling.
At standards level, yeah, I think so. There will be probably something in the standard space there as well.
Mm.
So, like Tony said, I think we've referred to other places where they're already prescribed, and I see there's a note about the WHS requirements. So again, they all come into play, and I think we would want to see them be in those minimum requirements wherever they're set out and relevant to the project.
Yep, no, that summarises it well. NFPA to cover those standards, and there is that new storage and handling of hydrogen standard that's being developed by ME93, which should address some of those issues as well. Maybe one aimed at Tony. Where will the requirements of holding a Cert 3 trade in plumbing, in addition to a gas certificate and potentially hydrogen specialised qualifications, apply?
Okay, so there's probably a bit of a question across both Paul and myself, but for my area around the fuel gas delivery, say particularly around service stations and dispensing, there won't be those sort of requirements. They'll be managed under the safety management system of the operator. So whatever qualifications they deem necessary to install there and maintain their infrastructure, that's what we'll be looking for. But we won't be a gas licence per se.
So that's at the operating plant level. And Paul, do you want to take on that from a gas device perspective?
Yep, sure. So as I mentioned, my area, which is the gas work and devices, becomes a little bit more prescriptive, and we follow the line of the national competencies when it comes to a certificate 3 in gas fitting. I'm currently sitting on a couple of committees looking at the gap analysis between a current certificate 3 in gas fitting and what the future certificate 3 in gas fitting may be, with some hydrogen competencies in there. So we won't be, as Tony alluded to in his previous response, we're not really expecting, I don't think, for the code of practice to actually stipulate particular requirements generally, but point to other documents or other reference points to achieve that. So once the units of competency for certificate 3 in gas fitting are settled, we will adopt those into our legislation, and then the certificate 3 in gas fitting will include gas fitting work in relation to hydrogen after the gas supply point. I think that covers it from my end of that.
Yep, no, I think that about summarises it. I do have another question about GDAA. So can a vehicle manufacturer be a GDAA? Maybe Paul.
Yes. That is a tricky question. Traditionally, we've separated the device approval from the gas work practitioner to give a peer review of the design of a device. So traditionally, it's been two separate entities. Even if it's within one engineering organisation, there's needed to be a clear delineation between those approving the device and those installing the device, so that there is a secondary view over the design of a device. But when it comes to fuel cells in vehicles, I'm imagining that we're going to have to maybe have a slightly different approach, and where there is a standard, an international standard for the design and the installation of a hydrogen fuel cell system in a vehicle, there is a potential within our legislation that we could just approve that as the approved design for Queensland. So if there was a particular vehicle manufacturer who mass produced a vehicle in a factory, and it came out OEM with a fuel cell in it, and that met the international standard requirements for the fuel cell and its installation, and all of the ADR compliance requirements, we could just approve that particular design. I suppose I don't know whether it's beneficial to say this at this point. The main reason for providing approval for those types of vehicles and those types of applications isn't to hinder those doing it at a manufacturer production level. It's to try and regulate those trying to retrofit or do other modifications to aftermarket. So there's a double edge to approving devices. It's to try and control that unregulated side of it as well. Does that work?
Yeah, I think it does, and it's questions like that that really show you the value of these sessions and help that will help scope out this document and make sure we kind of think through all the different scenarios when drafting it. So I think it was a really good question. Nancy, maybe one for you around the role of local council and how the PNG interacts with local council approvals, just maybe at a higher level, provide some thoughts on how that all works.
Yeah, I think typically with the approvals at council level, they're obviously looking at land use and other things. So there's a state agency referral process that generally will go to through OIR initially, and then they'll engage us if there's a hydrogen or fuel gas aspect. So I think that would remain in place. If we get the inquiry or the project initially, we might refer people to make sure they have the appropriate approvals for their council. But generally, anything that meets certain trigger points will come through the state agency referral process, and we will simply be a agency that looks at that and has our input and considerations through the standard process. I guess we would have feedback that way. Yeah,
no, thanks, Nancy. Question from David. How will hydrogen be treated when used in internal combustion engines, either spark ignited or compressed ignition? Paul, maybe that one's for you.
Yeah, sure. So that would meet our definition, as I said previously, we have a Type B device definition, which is the gas fuel system of a vehicle. So it would be treated as though the storage of the hydrogen, the piping of the hydrogen within the vehicle, and the method of injection into the internal combustion engine would be the Type B device, not the engine itself, and that would be managed under our gas work authorisation motor fuel framework.
Thanks. Yeah, that's pretty clear. I noticed there's a hand up from somebody. Was it Scott? Scott, do you want to share?
Yeah, I did take it in. I think Paul might have answered the question. It was more about with the Nexos currently deployed in Queensland and different states in Australia, along with the Mirai in several states. The vehicles are all currently in under type approval, given that they're deployed in Europe, North America, Korea, Japan, and other places. Assuming that if they meet that requirement and the ADRs here, as well as the different crash testing requirements, they'd be fine and suited under this proposal.
Paul, that one's probably maybe targeted at you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that's our current thinking on this. Is that, as I said, mass-produced OEM fuel cell vehicles built to an international standard and meeting the ADR rules, we will need to document in some way an approval for them, but we're not expecting to have to approve each individual vehicle as such. It will be a design approval, and basically, I think, speaking openly, I think it will be something along the lines of fuel cell vehicles manufactured, designed and manufactured to meet these standards are approved for use in Queensland, and it'll be just trying to capture those odd's not the right word, is it? But those smaller one-off fuel cell vehicles that may be built on lower production levels.
Yeah, no, that's good. Probably
Scott, if you could feed that into us in terms of your feedback on the discussion paper, and anyone else out in the audience that says that seems that the high level that Paul just described is probably the most sensible way to go. For us, Hyundai or the other ones presents less risk. Obviously, ADR, they've built, OEM vehicles for years. What gives us a slightly greater concern and potential risk is, no disrespect, but, a backyard operator may be trying to put in, do a hydrogen, vehicle themselves, and that may not have the safety architecture, manufacturing knowledge that, a Mack Trucks or a Volvo or a Hyundai may have. So if you think that's what Paul just outlined is a sensible way to go, Scott, please feed that to us and any other parties out there that I think like that or with slight modification. So that's the point of the discussion paper. And this is what we think. We're interested in what you out there in the industry and as key stakeholders think. Is that okay, Scott?
No, that's great. That's great, Bill and Paul. We actually had a session with the FCIO before this, with ourselves and Toyota and some other manufacturers looking to bring vehicles in, and it'd be great to have a similar session just with those technical reps from the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industry and also the technical guys work on this from the H2 Council. Because I think what you've said today's cleared up a lot of things and gives a lot of clarity. We do agree that we're concerned about the backyard as well. I've got a son that's a firefighter, and last thing I want is attending a vehicle he doesn't know how to handle it. We have emergency response guides for all of our vehicles, EVs and fuel cells, so they can be accessed anywhere at any time and deliver training to fire and rescue. The other one was probably, I'm on, is having a chat about what's required. So we do technician certification for our guys that are working on the vehicles. They've got to be a fully qualified trade technician for Cert 4 in automotive. They also going to be a Hyundai master technician, having the highest level of experience and skills. And then only at that point can they do the EV high voltage training for EVs, and then after that do the fuel cell training. So we make sure the guys jump through a number of barriers. So the dealership's been set up in Queensland and the one in the ACT for the 2 government fleet deployments. Those technicians are generally the most highly qualified in Australia from within our brand to work on these vehicles, but love to be able to work with you guys on what we've introduced as best practice out of Europe and for training our technicians across, I think we've got 55 dealers in Germany alone, plus the training that's done out of Korea to help assist with that.
You're giving it a good plug, Scott, so no problem. But please, if you give us that feedback, mate, and when you have a look at that discussion paper, that'd be great because, as I said, we don't want to regulate and issue a certificate for individual VIN numbers of Hyundai hydrogen vehicles or other well-known brands out there. So hopefully that's answered your question, mate, and I'll hand back to Croshy.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Scott. There's a question from David Mitchell. With standards, can we use the UK IGEM standards for guidance? Nancy, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, look, absolutely. There's lots of international documents, especially UK and the US documents. I think in the absence of Australian standards, that's where we would expect people to look at what's been done internationally, how do we comply with those, and for the most part, if you're meeting those international standards, then that's you're achieving a level of risk that's probably going to be as low as reasonably practical in Australia as well. We are adopting Australian standards aggressively, and I think that'll be the initial point of call. Daniel's alluded to the storage and handling of hydrogen document that's going to be coming out in the near term. So I think that's another area where it'll provide more guidance locally, but where there's no local guidance, all the international documents provide additional information. Absolutely, we would consider those in your risk management.
Thanks, Nancy. I missed one around from Kalpesh, who's asked some crackers actually. Looking for any information on hydrogen in tunnels, any requirements to modify tunnel ventilation or any infrastructure before we can start driving buses in tunnels. Nancy, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know lots of research going on there in the US around that. I think it's a question for TMR or our transport friends, so we'll certainly take that on notice and maybe feed that through to them. Yeah, we'd be sort of focusing on the bus side itself and the vehicle, but not so much where it is able to operate would be out of our jurisdiction.
A good answer, and I think that shows the importance of working with these other regulators and other government agencies to make sure whatever you develop suits everybody and fits in. Question from Murray from CQU. What is the perception of the current state of the art in modelling and probability data? This is probably more applicable to the fixed installations rather than mobility. I'm not sure. Nancy, have you got any thoughts around that? No.
I'm Murray here. I'm happy to elaborate a little bit. Look, so my background is in industry, and I spent a long time in BP. One of the things that's probably of interest to you is BP and Rio Tinto had a joint venture to look at large-scale utility power from hydrogen, and we completed detailed design on 2 of those projects about $2 billion ago. But like at the beginning of my career, my doctorate's in gas explosions. I did a lot of process safety, a lot of consequence modelling stuff for BP. So now I'm kind of across the piece trying to help facilitate these projects from CTU. I'm very used to, I firmly believe that hydrogen can be managed safely, but there was quite a push, certainly at the beginning of my career, post-Piper Alpha, to build the competence in the modelling and validate it. Now, hydrogen's not new by any means, but we're getting into lots of interesting new areas, and I'm seeing a lot of the old facilities in the UK be reactivated. Like I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with Spedatum, which is where a lot of the data from my doctorate came from. A lot of programs happening there. Curious to hear what the Australian regulator feels, especially as we move to the larger scale applications. Do you see a requirement to build the capability and revalidate the models, or are you kind of comfortable with what's there? Or is that a bigger discussion and I'm kind of off topic for today's webinar?
It's probably certainly a bigger discussion, and certainly that larger scale modelling is probably within the major hazard facility area as well. But yeah, absolutely, we'd be looking at how are the risks being managed to as low as reasonably practical, and the method or how you do that with the modelling and making sure they're appropriate would be, I guess, with the proponents to go through that. But yeah, a lot of that modelling and other information would be through the workplace health and safety, and the requirements would be within that regulatory body and the major hazard facility unit. So we probably can take that on notice as well and give you some feedback in liaison with them.
That would be great. So I appreciate a little bit off topic, and I messed up the time zones, so I'm looking forward to looking at the recording later as well.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I probably hadn't touched on that one, so all good.
Thanks, Nancy. Michelle from QUT, will there be a size limitations on these requirements or R&D exemption? As a university, we have small-scale hydrogen production, such as 2 kilowatt electrolyzers and 5-watt fuel cells in our labs. Will this constitute operating plant? I think in addition to that, schools and small little test and educational kits are something that falls into that category. So maybe Nancy, if you've got some thoughts on that.
Look, I think that's a great question and definitely something we'd need to consider in developing the code and our regulatory approach, for sure. So with the current operating plants, there are thresholds before you become an operating plant, and under that it might be managed in the gas device space, but certainly even R&D facilities and schools in general, maybe there's a framework that we have specifically to manage projects that fall in that category.
Yep, perfect.
And maybe also on that note, it's probably something that please provide the feedback on that. So what sizes are we seeing in terms of, you know, what's being developed and what's a reasonable threshold for what might be need a safety management system and an operating plant type documentation versus a small scale that maybe doesn't require that same level of information.
Thanks, Nancy. So Victoria, are there any considerations yet for the use of liquid storage on board vehicles, or will the code of practice consider liquid in general, and will it consider liquid on board storage? Nancy, maybe again.
So not specifically in the code. I mean, hydrogen in its liquid form would still be within the scope of where it's used as a fuel, would be within our scope. So we'd certainly be looking at the risks and how you're managing the risks in that space and what standards or international documents are being drawn on to design that safely and operate that safely. The code itself, especially given that we haven't probably got any current projects looking at liquid onboard vehicles, I don't know if there'll be anything specific on that, but certainly it would be if it's liquid on board a vehicle, I'd imagine that will go into the gas device space, and then maybe some considerations in that space as well that we need to take on board.
Thanks, Nancy. And maybe back to Paul. Does this code of practice, or will it consider hydrogen as a fuel additive or enhancer where there is no refueling station but does have compressed cylinders on board? And we also got another question just around the HIDE units where there might be a small onboard electrolyzer on a vehicle and inject straight into the intake of an engine. So have you guys had any thought around how you might manage those?
So is that, yes. So yes, it will cover hydrogen as a fuel additive or enhancer where it's used as a fuel. So if it's part of the propulsion of the vehicle, it will be covered, and it will cover the compressed cylinders on board, the filling of those cylinders on board, or the unloading and replacement.
Thanks. And a question from Kevin. I guess, how does the Lavo system and those small power generation units fit into this code of practice? Paul or Nancy?
Well, I guess in my mind, it's not that the Lavo system will fit into the code of practice, more that the code of practice will point a similar development project where to go for the information and how to achieve approval. That's kind of what I envisage it to be, rather than the code of practice actually addressing the Lavo system or similar system directly.
Yeah, no, that's a good response. And there's a question from David. Is there a threshold storage volume at which a hydrogen refueling station or facility becomes a major hazard facility, as in WA? Nancy, maybe you can talk to that one.
Yeah, there is, and I think the thresholds are similar or the same as WA. So 50 tonne is the threshold for a major hazard facility for hydrogen. Obviously, you've got to take into account other hazardous chemicals on site if there's other fuels. And it's notifiable at 5 tonnes, so it may be that a lower storage volume of 5 tonne or above could be determined, and then may check So yes, those exist. They're within the workplace health and safety legislation, and they still apply.
Thanks. Back to Diana. Should there be an upper limit on the amount and/or pressure of hydrogen on a fuel cell vehicle, considering risk in residential areas? Paul?
Nancy?
I think we'd probably, again, take that on board and consideration, but I would imagine we'll refer that back to the international standards here and what's being done in that space. As we said earlier, there's a lot of OEMs and the Toyotas and the Hyundais that exist all around the world, and they're designed to international standards. And obviously, they've got a very high storage pressure in them, but I think we'd be deferring to the risk management that's done through those standards and design principles.
Yeah, no, I think that answers that well. Peter Harris, so has the accuracy of the H2 dispensing devices been resolved to work within Australian fiscal metering accuracy requirements? Recently, European devices with accuracies of 2% were being touted, whereas Australian weights and measures requirements are nearer to 1%. Very, very specific question, but maybe Nancy, if you've got any thoughts, otherwise we might take that one offline and come back.
Yeah, it's probably not specific to the mobility sector, but I'm not aware of the tolerances on the gas metering. But there's certainly are requirements to make sure that what is billed, for example, is accurate, within a certain tolerance, as mentioned, and that would be part of the consideration for doing that injection. But I think that would be an offline and maybe a discussion around the network side.
Yeah, no, good. We'll note that one and come back with a better response. Is Marshall in the room? Marshall Holmes?
Yes, mate, he's with me. So
look, we've got a question for you, Marshall. With hydrogen being injected into the main natural gas lines, what will be the maximum percent being injected into the pipelines, and how will it be regulated to maintain the right percentage? So, Marshall.
Okay, currently we're the current projects are all around the natural gas specification. So it's basically less than 10% hydrogen is treated as a part of the natural gas specification. We're working with Future Fuel CRC to look at all the applications to increase that. AG8 committees going through the AS4645 standard right now to look at clause by clause what needs to be changed to go from its current levels of hydrogen injection up to 100%. So it's a moving target, and part of this code of practice is to look at all those gaps in the legislation right now.
No, good summary. There's plenty of work going on in that space, and I think the next few years there'll be some good research coming out.
Yeah, Future Fuel CRC is doing a huge amount of research in this space. In the pipeline sector, we're actually developing another code of practice for pipelines. Same thing there. Look at all the gaps in the Australian Standard 2.85 to cover hydrogen and all its considerations. Based on the ASME B3112 standard and all the gaps there.
Perfect. What is the moisture level acceptable in hydrogen refueling? Nancy or Marshall? Got any thoughts on that? Otherwise, might have to take that one offline as well.
I think probably the response there will be the quality requirement for the gas being supplied. That'll be a user requirement, and there are quality standards and things like that, but it's probably outside of the safety regulatory framework to determine what that is, but certainly an agreement would need to be reached, and the users would have to work out how they manage that quality of the gas.
Yep.
There is an ISO standard governing the fuel quality control for dispensers, but as Nancy said, the OEM vehicle owners would also have requirements for the quality of gas going into their systems, I'm sure. So currently we haven't got an answer for that off top of our heads, so we'd like to look into it.
Yeah, no, we can come answer that one offline and come back with a good response.
Excuse me, Australia adopted ISO standard for quality of hydrogen for the fuel cell application, in this case it's cars as well. So it's published in 2020, so it's already referenced there.
Yeah, 14687. Yeah. A question from Kevin. It's a comment from Kevin around the accuracy of meter, specifically Coriolis. So thanks for that, Kevin. Jeff, more of a point to look at into offline than a question, but in regards to the leak detection systems, we need to think about the storage, parking of H2 vehicles, i.e. at home, in a closed garage or in an underground car park, where there is a leak or could be a major risk. Yeah, definitely a really good point, Jeff. And so I think that covers most of, or addresses most of the questions. Has anybody got any final questions? Murray's just popped one in. Is there an Australian resource for safety lessons learned around hydrogen? Nancy, have you got any thoughts?
Sorry, Dan, what was that?
Is there an Australian resource for safety lessons learned around hydrogen?
Not in Australia that I'm aware of, but there is some international work there. There is a database that the Centre for Hydrogen Safety from the US has on lessons from losses from hydrogen. So I will try and source that link and put it out with the minutes.
Yeah, FFCRC are doing a lot of work in that space around lessons learned. So there's some good learnings there. I think there's also discussions about where do we capture all these standards and application and a bit of guidance around it. So there could be new databases in the future.
Yeah, can I just, sorry. Yeah, I think the thing that's interesting to me, I mean, obviously we're talking about the safety space, but there's tremendous collaboration between all the industry partners. And there's a phenomenal opportunity for lessons learned here. So I think there's lots of good evidence internationally of, you know, bad things that have happened with hydrogen in the past, but we're going to have some specific Australia-based lessons about either progressing through the new regulations that you're putting in place or actually deploying these projects. So I think that's a huge opportunity to create some extra value and help keep Australia ahead of the curve of everyone else if we've got our own localized lessons learned systems.
Thanks, Murray. I'll ask anybody with their hands up. Can they enter their questions in? It just makes it a bit easier. Type them in. Just makes it a bit easier to address them all. There was a question from David Mitchell. With 100% hydrogen, flame rod does not work. All hot water units use ionizing flame detection. Do we have a solution for this? Maybe. Nancy, if you've got some thoughts on that, otherwise maybe take that one offline.
Yeah, it's probably maybe even Paul's area, but I think again it will come down to the device and the design of the device and how that is going to operate to detect flames in the, you know, if that type of sensor does not work, what other sensors will be used in place of to do flame detection. And I know that the hydrogen flame is a bit different to a natural gas and LPG flame, so there might be some different design requirements for those devices. Or have you got anything?
Yeah, so it might be pertinent just to add that there's a number of projects going on nationally and internationally looking at the design of gas appliances. We're doing some work through Future Fuels and through ME93. IGM and BSI have done some work in the UK. So I'm not sure that there is actually a solution for it at this time, David, but there is a lot of work going on in the background. And as I said before, I think it's probably important to clarify that the code of practice won't point directly to solutions like that. It would point to the resource where that solution can be found.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think that's probably all the questions at the moment, unless anybody's got any final quick questions or any questions.
And they can keep feeding him in, Daniel, to the the address there on the PowerPoint slide. hydrogen safety at rshq.qld.gov.au. And obviously, as I mentioned before, this recording, the PowerPoint slides, contact details of the guys that briefed today, Paul and Tony, Nancy, Marshall, etc. Will be made available to all, because this is not the end of the conversations. In fact, it's pleasing that we had some really good questions. Some we have thought through, and others we go, okay, great point, we'll take that on board. And clearly, hopefully, with can a hydrogen bus go through a tunnel, and some of the questions around MHF, that shows the value and the absolute need for us to be hardwired into that broader Queensland government, other agencies who own those pieces of safety and health in their relevant space. And I think we're pretty well across that in terms of our partnerships and arrangements. Like, I know Grant Hastie's out there somewhere in the audience and has chimed in a few times, so thanks, mate. Look, next steps, we're up to the balloons that you can see there. So we've had the webinar, the feedback on the paper, please send that in. There's a closing data on that, and some of it you mentioned today about, for example, about the OEM and the vehicle manufacturer. Appreciate that, because that obviously will feed into what Daniel Cross and the guys are doing at GPA in terms of shaping this draft up of this code of practice. Well, the draft is intended to be available in January next year, and then, as I mentioned before, we'll go through a consultation process with all those on the call today and others, for example, the other jurisdictions, and get comment back on the draft before we finalise it in that sort of March timeframe. And then, as I mentioned before, the intent is to make it enforceable sometime in 2022. That's subject to Queensland government processes that are not in my control. But the key thing is the draft code of practice, based on today's input, your feedback to the discussion paper, and any other questions you may have that you can shoot into that generic email address will be much valued. Some will load in this, some will go into this code of practice, and others, for example, may be handed off to the relevant agencies like MHF, etc., or Main Roads, and then we can just post those things on our website to sort of have a bit of a FAQ, so that people have got a common touch point in terms of resources and information. Question asked, question answered. That's in my mind. But I want to thank you all for your time this morning. It's much appreciated, notwithstanding time zones and wherever we are around the globe listening into this thing. Your contribution is very valued. And as I said, those that we regulate or have involvement with should absolutely have a say, and that's our mantra here in the Petroleum and Gas Inspectorate, and hence my acknowledgement of the value of your time, and then your feedback is really important to us. All right, so without any further ado, I will draw our first webinar to a close. I will flag with you that we will get back together in the new year once we've got a draft and we seek some comments back on the key parts of that draft code of practice, and obviously keep the ongoing dialogue with the experts. So thank you very much, and as I said, I'll draw the meeting to a close. Thank you all for your time and have a safe day. Take care.
Daniel, do you have time for a quick catch up after this session?
Thanks, Dan. I'll jump off now.
Hold on, Nancy.